So it's now 1:15 we are launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, so we are now formally starting this event. I would like to start by thanking the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Dr. Marcos Orellana, for bringing us together for 3 days of discussions and reflections that kicked off this morning. This parallel event to the 54th session of the Human Rights Council is indeed part of the 3rd edition of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks, organized by the Special Rapporteur in collaboration with Earth Justice and the Geneva Environment Network. The Geneva Toxic Free Talks aim to harness the opportunity of this moment of the year when the Special Rapporteur is in Geneva to present his thematic report to the Council to reflect on the challenges posed by the production, use, and dissemination of toxics, as well as how Geneva contributes to bringing together the actors working in resolving the toxic time. And we are joined indeed today by representatives of some of the numerous processes based in Geneva that are part of what we call here the Geneva Chemicals and Waste Cluster. I'm Lena Rizzolio, the coordinator of the UNEP Geneva Environment Network, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this session. Our talk this afternoon, we look at how we can make human rights central in the chemicals and waste discussions and negotiations. We will be discussing steps that have been taken to integrate human rights into ongoing negotiations. And we will also explore how this can be further strengthened in ongoing and future discussions. The discussion we are having today comes indeed at a timely moment, as various important international environmental negotiations addressing chemicals, waste and pollution are taking place this year in Geneva and beyond, bringing developments in international law on toxic substances and pollution. You have here an image on the screen with a crazy environmental agenda of all the important negotiations where we address environment, and this is certainly a list that is not completed. But we had indeed earlier this year here in Geneva the conference of the parties to the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. We will have, the colleagues are already in Bonn now for the 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management, who will kick off officially next week in Bonn, but preparatory meetings are already there and many of our friends and colleagues are there. We have also coming up later this year here in Geneva the 5th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Minamata Convention in November. We have the negotiations on a future treaty on plastics that will hold its 3rd session in Nairobi in November this year. We have the Future Science Policy Platform on Toxic Substances and Pollution, which will be discussed at a meeting to be held in Jordan in December this year. And we have had this year, I could mention, for example, the interesting achievements that we had at the World Health Assembly. When I say we, it's the member states who presented their resolution that I'm sure will be mentioned in the opening remarks. In all these discussions, human rights have a central role to play, as the raison d'être of these instruments and institutions is to protect humans and their natural environment. So this event also, I wanted to add something because I have here Ana Paula close to me, builds on other sessions and events that have been co-organized with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and others who are around this table that took place during the 1st semester of this year, where we discuss advancing and strengthening a human rights-based approach to pollution for people and the planet. This, for example, as side events to Conference of the Parties and on other occasions. So you will now be formally welcomed by Her Excellency Ambassador Romy Tikopa, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Peru to the United Nations Office in Geneva. Peru, we are delighted to be joined by Peru. They have been at the forefront of various initiatives and processes to advance the global governance of toxic substances, making and strengthening links with various processes in international Geneva and beyond. We are therefore, as I just said, delighted to be joined by you, Excellency, for the opening of this event. And before I hand over to you, just let me remind that because this is a question that we keep receiving, the documents, the summary, everything will be available on the webpage of the event, and the link has been shared on the screen. And throughout the event, those who are online have also access to automatic transcript in various languages. And you can see now on the screen how you can access that. So with that, Excellency, we are delighted to give you the floor.
Thank you, Diana. Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Geneva Environment Network for inviting Peru to be here, and also thanks them for its engagement in the process of negotiation on the fusion instrument of the end plastic pollution. I will focus my remarks on the plastic treaty. We consider that we are currently at a crucial moment in the multilateral environment agenda, having started the negotiations of a treaty, important treaty that will end plastic pollution. And we are going to have next November, the third meeting of that, and we already have a draft, set of draft text on this treaty. So there are a lot of things that we can start a negotiation in order to have ambitious and robust document. For us, for Peru, the issue of plastic pollution is transversal and cross-cutting issue that has a considerable impact on the wide range of human rights, including the right of life, to health, to an adequate housing, to education, and a healthy environment. For example, vulnerable groups, including women, indigenous women, rural women, children, workers, and waste pickers are exposed to toxic chemical or air pollution from waste incineration. That's why we should call for the treaty to be firmly rooted in a human rights-based approach that reduces inequality between persons, enable a just transition, and protects the environment. We also believe that the treaty should consider a gender approach. I guess this is very important, and it has been little discussed, I guess, in this issue in the negotiations. We know that plastic pollution affects women and men in different manners, and also in terms of opportunity, risk, exposure, and health outcomes. Also, we know that women can be important agents of change, protecting the environment, and help with their small communities and their children and everyone around them. We also need to be aware that plastic pollution disproportionately affects developing countries and social economical challenged community working in informal and cooperative settings. That is why we need a strong treaty with ambitious goals that consider the need of developing countries. As more concrete provision, the plastic treaty should also include a mechanism to regulate those chemicals of concern. For example, through a negative and positive approach of listing chemical simplification. That means that a specific provisions do not allow and also eliminate the use of certain chemicals. We consider also that we need to continue the need to acknowledge and broaden awareness despite growing evidence that the effect of some of the chemicals used in plastic are harmful both to the environment and to humans. I stop here, I guess, and coming after if we have questions.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I'm here, sorry, try to, playing with the camera so that people can also see us online. For starting, so thank you very much, Excellency, for starting and setting the scene for this event in your opening remarks. So after you welcome, we turn now to the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, who will now add some comments on the importance of having such a parallel session to the human rights mechanism, including to the Council. Dr. Orellana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana. My name is Marcos Orellana. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. I wish to thank, first of all, the Geneva Environment Network for partnering in the organization of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. And if I could start perhaps with a bit of an anecdote, I was speaking with my colleague Pedro Arrojo, who's the Special Rapporteur on the right to water, and he began his talk saying, "I love water." I can't say the same thing about toxics, unfortunately, but I love the opportunity to have these toxic free talks dialogues in Geneva to address some of the most topical issues of concern. And what could be more topical than the question of how to integrate human rights considerations in the chemicals and waste cluster instruments? Let me step back perhaps and look at this issue from a historical perspective. Last year we celebrated 50 years of the seminal Stockholm Declaration on the human environment. And one of the things that clearly came out of that discussion was the need for the recognition of the right to a healthy environment. This was in a way the unfinished business of Stockholm. At the time of the conference, let's recall, there were several voices that advocated for the conference to recognize this right, to embrace a human rights-based approach. In the end, the conference declaration contains important elements, but the action plan moved in a different direction and embraced a management approach. And that has been what has inspired the development of international environmental law at the global level, of comparative law in so many countries. So the vision of reducing pollution, controlling and reducing, minimizing, in the assumption and faith that the carrying capacity of the planet would be able to absorb this and we would then be within the planetary boundaries. But reality, as often is the case, clearly evidences that that is not what happened. The scientific evidence of planetary boundaries on chemicals and waste being exceeded speak to the profound impacts that this has for humanity, for the human rights of countless individuals and groups around the world. And since chemicals and waste instruments are premised on this notion of risk management and reducing and minimizing, it means that it is out of sync with the current scientific evidence and the imperatives of what needs to be done. This explains why it is not delivering its full potential. It also calls for a change in direction, and that change in direction is embracing a human rights-based approach. There are elements and there are seeds in chemicals and waste instruments. Elements such as in the preambles, recognitions of the vulnerable situations of indigenous peoples in certain instruments, seeds in access to information provisions in certain instruments as well. But there's no embracement explicitly of a human rights-based approach that would put the right to a healthy environment at the core of what is intended with these instruments, that would articulate access to information provisions effectively, that would make a reality of access to remedies. In the resolution that most recently renewed the Toxics and Human Rights mandate, the Human Rights Council guided and requested information on developments, gaps, and shortcomings in international instruments on chemicals and wastes. And on that guidance, for example, I have engaged the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Conference of the Parties, including statements, written and otherwise, first report, the General Assembly, was on plastics and human rights, also engaging the UN Environment Assembly to address the gaps in plastic pollution regulations. In respect of Minamata, produced a report presented to the Council on the largest source of mercury emissions and releases to the environment, which is small-scale gold mining. When it comes to the 5th session of International Conference on Chemicals Management, I'm very pleased to see that the statement and the leadership of my mandate is finally out. I don't know if at some point maybe we can put it on screen or share it with the participants, but that's available online. And so much more could be said about various gaps and shortcomings, but the basic point is the pivoting towards embracing a human rights-based approach so that chemicals and waste instruments can be made more effective. And this is the time, this is the moment, and so I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share the panel with all of you and to learn about the specific experiences and that you bring to the table. Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Orellana. Now that we have heard why it is important to have this discussion and the imperatives linked to the topic that we are discussing this afternoon, let's move to the panel discussion. As I mentioned, we are joined by colleagues representing the secretariats of various environmental conventions, negotiating committees, or part of the Bureau of Mechanisms tasked with moving forward the sound management of chemicals and waste and the ending pollution agenda. So let's start by the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention. We are joined by David Ogden, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the three conventions. David, let's hear from you the steps that have been taken by the parties of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions and the Secretariat on discussing and integrating human rights in the processes you're leading. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Ambassador and Special Rapporteur, and I also look forward to hearing from my colleagues in the other secretariats. The topic that doesn't make the headlines, but is a silent and ever-looming issue that impacts millions, is the need to make human rights central in discussions about chemicals and waste management. The relationship between chemicals, waste, and human rights is far more interconnected than many realize. Chemicals are indispensable part of modern life, found in our medicine, food, and countless everyday products. But when they're improperly managed, they can pose serious threats to human health and the environment. Consequently, we have a collective and urgent responsibility to ensure that our policies and practices respect and uphold the rights of all. Human rights, as we all know, are part of the DNA of the United Nations, and although the words human rights are not explicitly mentioned in the text of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, the implementation of these conventions is intrinsically linked to upholding human rights principles. BRS conventions prescribe a life cycle approach to the management of hazardous chemicals and waste, all placing the protection of human health and the environment at the core of their respective mandates. By ensuring that chemicals and waste are managed in ways that are transparent, equitable, and that safeguard human health and the environment, these international agreements contribute to the realization of human rights on a global scale. For instance, and there's several areas that the BRS conventions contribute to the observance of human rights, and these are as follows. First is the right to life and safety. We're all aware of the hazardous chemicals and waste can seep into water supplies, lead to air pollution, and can contaminate food chains, thereby posing serious risk to human life. The second is the right to health. Exposure to toxic chemicals can lead to a multitude of health problems, from acute poisoning to long-term issues like cancer and birth defects. The third is the right to a healthy environment. Chemicals and waste pollution can negatively impact an individual and community's right to live in an environment that is conducive to their health and well-being. The right to information. Communities often aren't informed about hazardous waste that they're exposed to, denying them the ability to make informed decisions to protect their health. And just as a side, when I started work in the national government, it was following it was Fort Hall flood disaster where thousands of people were poisoned from a pesticide plant, and thousands died, I should say. Many more were poisoned by that. And then the idea was how do you actually put in place regulations that would make communities aware of where these chemicals were. So they're actually, in the country that I came from, they're very well mapped out, where these are. So it allows you to be, you have the right to that sort of information. In fact, it became part of the Chapter 19 of the Agenda 21, you'll find the community right to know is actually built into that as well. The right to participation then is the fifth area, and marginalized communities frequently have little to say about decisions that impose to hazardous waste. Another important area, of course, is environmental justice, and that there is to be able to apply focus chemical waste management. Often it is the underprivileged and marginalized who bear the brunt of improper chemicals management, chemical waste management, further deepening social inequalities and putting these vulnerable groups more likely to be in harm's way from the effects of these chemicals that are around them. Given the stakes, it's imperative that to continue bringing human rights to the center of the discussion. The BRS has also done this through participation in the UN High Commission for Human Rights Community Practice Group and the Environmental Rights Coordination Group, which hold informal discussions on human rights and the environment. BRS also collaborates with the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights in various areas, including there's a side event at the Conference of the Parties of the BRS conventions on children and their exposure to pesticides and other chemical strategies to reduce risk, as well as protect and promote their rights. Or on regular rights, we also provide regularly inputs into their reports and country visits on different thematic issues. Secretary also contributes to regular sessions of the Human Rights Council and other related activities. Now, turning to what the BRS parties can contribute. First of all, parties can conduct comprehensive human rights impact assessments before implementing chemicals policies or waste management plans. Parties must ensure that all legislation and practices are in line with their human rights commitments under international law. BRS parties can increase transparency. We must work towards comprehensive chemical disclosure requirements and labeling so that consumers can make informed decisions. And then BRS parties can prioritize community participation. Inclusion of local communities in decision-making processes not only upholds the principle of participatory governance, but also contributes to more effective and sustainable management waste management solutions. And more generally, strengthening multilateral and global cooperation is, of course, very important. Chemicals waste does not respect national boundaries. It can travel through air and water and affect communities long distances from their source. Hence, international cooperation is crucial. We found this out before even beginning the negotiations of the Stockholm Convention. There was a study in Canada that was looking at PCB levels in human milk in the Great Lakes area. And what they found is, those were pretty high, but then they looked to the Inuits thinking that would be an unaffected control group, and they found that they were even much higher. So these are people long distance from the source that are affected by activities that are far from them. And then in conclusion, I'll just say that making human rights central to the discussions about chemical waste management is not optional, it's not an add-on, it's a necessity. Our shared humanity demands that we tackle these issues head-on, creating inclusive, equitable, and sustainable solutions for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Let's move now to another process, and then when we have done the round of the processes, Marcos, I will turn to you and we will discuss how some of these initiatives that have been mentioned can be further strengthened. So let's move to the plastics, the future plastics treaty. Last year, the UN Environmental Assembly, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, made history in adopting a resolution that set the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. And the resolution requested the convening of an intergovernmental negotiating committee to develop this legally binding instrument. And we are joined today by Brenda Kokuk, who is part of the secretariat of this intergovernmental negotiating committee, which has already held 2 sessions and is preparing its 3rd session, which will take place in Nairobi in November. And actually, we also might have it already mentioned, but the committee is currently chaired by Peru. Brenda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thanks to the Geneva Environment Network for the invitation. So the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a key concept in considering chemicals waste, of course. I'm really pleased to bring this major development in international law and pollution into the conversation today. So the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on Plastic Pollution will be developing an international instrument on plastic pollution, as you all know. And we are really faced with a crisis. Research shows that humans produce around 430 million tons of plastic a year, and without urgent action, that could triple by 2060. Under a business as usual scenario, plastics could emit 19% of global greenhouse gas emissions allowed under a 1.5 degree scenario by 2040. And the sheer volume produced and discarded every year is just having negative impacts on ecosystems, wildlife, climate, human health, and the economy. So, it's critically important to address the crisis. To give you a quick update on the latest status of the intergovernmental process, we are preparing for the 3rd session of the negotiating committee from the 13th to the 19th of November this year. And this will be located at our UNEP headquarters in Nairobi. Nairobi is, of course, where the resolution was adopted last year. And our motto for this session is we must keep that Nairobi spirit alive at INC3 and really advance the discussion. This, of course, is the 3rd of 5 sessions where we do anticipate the conclusion of the agreement by the end of 2024 in line with our UNEA decision. For this 3rd session, I just want to raise a few items. The 11th of November, we will be holding a preparatory day at the session to primarily discuss elements not discussed at INC 1 and 2 and to a large extent. And I will go into that in a little bit. The 12th of November will be regional meetings, and all working documents are available online at the moment, mostly in advanced English versions, and languages will be available in early October. So in terms of key documents, I just want to raise 2 of them to get some conversation and context going. Our 0 draft was released 2 weeks ago in advanced English. This is a critical document, of course, prepared by the chair of the INC, which of course is Ambassador Gustavo Meza-Cuadra from Peru, with support of our secretariat. This draft is guided by views expressed by members at the 1st and 2nd sessions. It'll be a crucial milestone to advance consideration, understanding, and articulation of some of the main elements of the future instrument, and really is the first time there's text on the table for negotiation. The second document I want to raise is a synthesis document that the Secretariat is currently preparing based on submissions that have been submitted to the Secretariat on elements not discussed at INC 1 and INC 2. And this will include principles and scope, as well as other considerations such as preamble, governing bodies, secretariat, subsidiary bodies, and other final provisions. This document will be released as an information document for INC3 and will be available in 2 weeks ahead of the meeting with complimentary translations also provided. At INC3, of course, we hope member states can decide to move swiftly to the substantive discussions, and particularly in negotiating these documents I've mentioned. So now just to quickly touch on considerations in what I see in my personal reflections in looking at what we're preparing for the session. You know, countries have clearly made it clear they wish to have an instrument that addresses the full life cycle of plastic, protects human health and the environment, and pays special attention to unique circumstances of those countries and groups most in need of support. So the 3 key points I want to just bring to the table today are first, clearly there's room for human rights concepts to be included in the instrument, in particular in principles and preambular text. And that is currently being elaborated in our synthesis report, which we are using and building on some of the submissions. And some of the things we are hearing from the submissions include concepts such as the polluter pays principle, prevention and precautionary principle, intergenerational equity, rights-based approach, the right to a healthy environment, right to access to information, effective participation and access to justice, just transition, especially for waste pickers, gender perspective. And furthermore, the need for technical and financial assistance is there, particularly for small island developing states and least developed countries. That's the first point. The second thing I just want to raise is that human rights linked concepts are already included in the provisions of the Zero draft. And the 3 things I wanted to raise are just that clearly the protection of human health is firmly based there, including in the proposed objective. Furthermore, there is a provision proposed on the just transition to ensure waste pickers and vulnerable communities around the world, as well as other workers throughout the life cycle of plastics, have decent jobs and a safe, healthy environment. And thirdly, there is an article set out proposed on transparency, tracking, monitoring, and labeling. So this really reinforces the right to know, and is particularly important in the chemicals and waste agenda in protecting human health. The third key point I just want to raise before I close off is inclusiveness as an important underpinning of the process. So we see a strong level of engagement in the INC process, from written submissions to participation in webinars and side events. Observers are constantly engaged in the process before, during, and after our sessions. We had close to 750 individuals from 300 observer organizations attending INC2. And amongst the attendees, we had participation of waste pickers, youth, health, women, and environmental advocacy organizations. Similarly to INC2, for INC3, we have an application process for funded participants, and 20 observers have been selected for travel support to INC3. Please note that the registration deadline for INC3 is the 6th of October, so it's closely coming up. And we do not expect to have space limitations at INC3, as our headquarters at Nairobi is large, and we hopefully will not be able to have to set any restrictions that way. So observers play an important role in building momentum for the INC and bringing forth solutions to tackle plastic pollution. So in terms of inclusiveness in this process, as well as in the Zero draft, there is a space for actors to engage in the implementation of the future instrument, and that is highlighted in the Zero draft through 2 particular provisions that I'd highlight. First being on promotion of international cooperation, and the second on stakeholder engagement. And under stakeholder engagement as an example, I'd just like to say that there is a proposal in line with the DNA, a resolution to establish an action agenda that promotes inclusive, representative, and transparent actions, and to promote active and meaningful participation of all relevant stakeholders in the development and implementation of this treaty, and also to accelerate ambitious actions. So that's in summary our perspective on engaging with the human rights agenda. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and we can build human rights into this from the outset. So I also just wish to say that ending with plastic pollution is not a job for governments alone. So we just want to engage with civil society, academia, women, children, and the informal sector. You're all an important part of the solution.
Thank you very much, Brenda, for sharing your perspective. We will now move to another process, the Minamata Convention on Mercury. The parties will meet in Geneva in a few weeks, in end of October, beginning of November. And we are joined today by Richard Gutierrez from the Minamata Convention Secretariat. And before I give him the floor, I will once more remind that at the last year, at the 51st session of the Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteur presented a thematic report that was dedicated to the use of mercury in small-scale mining and its impacts on human rights. And he engaged also a lot with the Minamata Convention on this topic. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana, and Excellencies, Marcos. Wonderful to see you again after a long time. Colleagues. First of all, we'd like to thank the Geneva Environmental Network, the Office of the Special Rapporteur on Justice, for putting this dialogue together. One of the key things that sort of is missing between human rights and when we talk about the environment is the common language and dialogue. So these types of dialogues are quite important in the Minamata Convention, especially the Secretary. It's a great pleasure to be here and share with you our thoughts as well on this important issue. Before I begin, I wanted to first thank David. He did a lot of the heavy lifting for me in terms of context setting. And I don't have to repeat what he said. The human rights is very much integrated. I totally agree with what he said. It's very much integrated in the UN and in our conventions. Article 1 of the Minamata Convention speaks about the protection of human health and the environment from the anthropogenic sources of mercury and mercury compounds. That's its main objective. So what I would like to do this afternoon is to show you how the convention is translating this directive into action, particularly in the upcoming top 5 in terms of what are the points that are going to be discussed. How is the convention going to take action and put to life Article 1? So I prepared some slides just to sort of help me guide along and guide you along, listeners, on what these topics are. And hopefully we can also play a game. You identify the human rights related to the topic, and I'll just stick to the topic. So I invite you to look at the first slide. So these are the substantive discussions. These are just summaries of it. But I'll just give you a flavor of what these topics are. And like I said, feel free to jot down which human rights are going to be addressed, because it's there. It might not be explicitly said, but it's there. And that's part of the dialogue and the gap between the environment and human rights that this type of discussion can help eliminate in terms of gaps. So first of all, mercury supply sources and trade. One of the key issues identified by parties in the past is the unrecognized mining, primary mining of mercury, and illegal unrecognized trade of mercury. So these are the supply sides that funnel, that put mercury in the largest sector and user, the largest sector that uses an emitter of mercury, which is ASGM. So that's going to be covered in top 5. The other item, thank you. The other item is mercury added products. So these are, for those of you who are not familiar, these are any products where mercury is added. We have proposed amendments that impact cosmetics, dental amalgam. And a key point of discussion as well is the phase-out dates for 4 new added mercury added products. Another very interesting point is that when we talk about not just management of mercury, but also looking at taking a human rights approach to chemicals, is that in top 4, the parties have decided to prohibit the use of dental amalgam on children, for children 15 years below, and also recognizing vulnerable populations, especially breastfeeding mothers, in which dental amalgam will not be allowed to be used on breastfeeding mothers. So there is that element of the recognition of a human rights approach in this broader context of management. Then you have the issue of ASGM. ASGM. This is the big elephant in the room. And a critical point that's coming up at COP5 is the review of the national action plans. There has to be a review mechanism, and this is an important instrument in which, again, integrating a human rights approach is going to be available, and it's certainly something that stakeholders need to pay attention to. And then, of course, emissions and releases, looking at the national action plan and inventories, and most importantly, the best available technologies and best environmental practices to control emissions. That's going to be discussed. National reporting, right to information. We are working towards improving the national reporting, to improve information, and most importantly, to make it available to the public. There are still issues that need to be overcome. For example, confidential use or the usual obstacles. But parties are willing, and we are working, again, to make these types of obstacles, overcome these obstacles, to make information available to everyone. A key aspect of the work that we have done, or at least COP5 will be looking at, is approving the gender action plan that's developed within the Geneva Convention. There's going to be a comprehensive, it's been an ongoing process, and the gender action plan will be, hopefully, be approved by the parties, which will mainstream gender in all activities of the convention. The other part of the work that I wanted to share with you is the intersessional work. If we talk about human rights and how it is addressed at the negotiations, it's going to be too late. Human rights and the human rights approach has to happen before the negotiations. And here, in this aspect as well, the Minamata Convention is actively engaged. A couple of examples on indigenous people. Prior to COP5, we have compiled the views of indigenous peoples and local communities, and this is reflected in the document. Will be part of the ASGM discussion. We've also compiled data on monitoring of mercury and mercury compounds in and around ASGM communities. Another aspect of the intersessional work that the Secretariat and the Convention is doing in recognition of the human rights approach is to provide meaningful engagement with stakeholders. And what are some of these examples? Ensuring that there's participation in open-ended and technical working groups as well as regional meetings, ensuring that there's clear process in terms of how to participate. Also, another important part is the brown bag sessions with the Executive Secretary. We've had 2 sessions. We've started this process back in COP4, and we have been continuing this throughout the year, in which stakeholders have direct line to the Executive Secretary to discuss issues that affect them and issues that they are working with, and for us to be able to address. One thing that I forgot was in the indigenous discussion is that there is, for the upcoming RULAC meeting of the convention in October 5, there's an indigenous peoples dialogue that the Secretariat is hosting together with the government of Brazil to highlight the priorities and needs of the indigenous communities as they are affected in ASGM. So the results of that discussion will be shared at the following RULAC meeting, and then hopefully the region will pick that up and take that up at the top. So I end my sort of quick discussion on that, and then before I end, I just wanted to re-emphasize that there's a clear gap in the dialogue and in the language used between human rights and when we talk about environment, especially within the realm of chemicals and wastes. And I hope that we can continue this, and the Secretary again thanks the organizers to provide us with this venue to share with you, not just our work, but also in the hopes of addressing chemicals and especially mercury, and hoping that mercury can make mercury useful. Thank you very much, and I wrap my talk here. Back to you, Leanne.
Thank you very much, Richard. Let's now move to a colleague who has joined us online. We couldn't have with us the colleagues from the Secretariat preparing the International Conference on Chemicals that is taking place in Bonn, because they are actually very busy in handling what's happening next week. But we have with us a colleague from the civil society. We have with us Therese Carlson, who works for IPEN. IPEN is also part of the Bureau of the International Conference on Chemicals Management that is, as I mentioned, convening soon in Bonn, and also engaged in all the process that we have that are here around this table and others that didn't join us today. Therese, I'm turning to you to hear from a civil society perspective. What's your take on how we are moving on advancing human rights in all these processes?
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for having me here today. It's been very interesting to follow the discussion so far, and I'm very grateful to all of the organizers for setting up these timely discussions. Excellencies, colleagues, as you know, today there are over 350,000 chemicals, of which only a tiny, tiny fraction are regulated. These chemicals are used in a shockingly untransparent manner and are underpinning the current triple planetary crisis that we are in. Next slide, please. This year, climate change has become increasingly evident with record temperatures across the world. The vast majority of plastics and chemicals are made from fossil fuels, and these are exacerbating the climate crisis during production, during use, and during the end of life. We are also seeing a dramatic biodiversity loss. The growing use of toxic pesticides is a big contributor to this, as pesticides are made to be toxic. This, in combination with other toxic chemicals, are having adverse effects on ecosystems and biodiversity across the globe. The pollutants and pollution is also growing at an alarming rate, with linkages to infertility and growing cancer rates. And we're seeing how toxic chemicals are poisoning communities and jeopardizing human rights all over the world. Next slide, please. IPEN is a global network of civil society organizations from over 120 countries, and we see over and over again how the right to a healthy environment, the right to science, and the right of future generations are being compromised in favor of industry interests. Through years of global studies, we've seen how plastic wastes are poisoning food in communities all over the world. We've seen how non-transparent manner in which waste trade is currently happening is causing widespread and reckless destruction and jeopardizing countries' abilities to handle their own wastes. And we've seen how techniques that industry actors often claim are the solution, such as, for example, plastics recycling, expose workers and consumers to increasing level of toxic chemicals. We are seeing in analysis after analysis that recycled plastics contain toxic chemicals and that there is no information for workers or consumers on what they are actually being exposed to. The current negotiations, including the Plastics Treaty, the Future Science Policy Panel on Chemicals and Waste, and of course the work under BRS, SAICM, Minamata, and other MEAs, they all present amazing opportunities to safeguard the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the human right to information, as well as the right for future generations. But in order to do that, health and the environment needs to be in the center for all of these negotiations. Next slide, please. This will require that the processes are transparent and contain robust conflict of interest policies. These processes should be focused on protecting human health and the environment, and industry interests cannot be allowed to guide these processes. Here it is also important to note the importance of transparent access to information. In the Stockholm Convention, it says in Article 9 that for the purposes of this convention, information on health and safety of humans and the environment shall not be regarded as confidential. And this is important. This also links into the right to information. It will also require that these negotiations are focused on upstream measures. Waste issues are of course important, but they are only symptoms of the underlying problems. If we don't address the issues of toxic chemicals at the extraction and production phases, the waste will only continue to grow. We need to decrease production overall, and we need to regulate the production and use of chemicals. Focus on a rapid phase out of toxic chemicals that are causing harm or have the potential to cause harm on human health and the environment. In this work, it will be important that the precautionary principle is guiding. This means that lack of full scientific certainty shall not be an hindrance towards taking regulatory action to protect the human right to a clean and healthy environment. Protecting this right will also require that chemicals are regulated as groups whenever possible. We see over and over again how one toxic chemical is substituted with another toxic chemical, often from the same group of chemicals. Again, today there are over 350,000 manufactured chemicals, and we simply do not have the time or the resources to use a chemical by chemical approach. In order to protect the human right to clean environment and the rights for future generations, we must work more efficiently with regulating chemicals and eliminating toxic chemicals as groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Therese. We have heard some converging messages this afternoon. I'm now turning to Ana Paula de Souza, who is the Chemicals and Waste Specialist within the environmental team at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Ana Paula, we have seen the team you're part of being very present, not only with the Chemicals and Waste cluster, but with other clusters, in really advocating for having human rights mentioned in numerous treaties and in numerous discussions that are ongoing at the global level. So I'm turning to you. You have been present in all the processes that have been represented here this afternoon to bring your take on what has been mentioned and what you can add to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Earth Justice, and thank you, the Special Rapporteur, for making this meeting possible. It's necessary, and we need to talk more about this, about these topics, about pollution, about chemical and waste, about plastics. We need more conversation of that. Bring us together. And it's particularly reassuring to hear the words of Ambassador Tim Coppa on Peru's vision for the plastic treaty, firmly rooted on human rights. That's our hope as well. As Diana has mentioned, we have been following up the BRS COPs. We will be present at the Minamata COP. We're also going to be present at the DRULAC prep meeting for the Minamata COP. So I will follow up with you on the meeting on indigenous peoples. We are engaging in the open-ended working group, SAICM ICCM5, INC, and different consultations being organized by UNEP, derived from a mandate from UNEA. All its HR contributions in these processes are available in our website. I can share the link afterwards. Basically, it's under information materials in the page, Human Rights and Climate Change. You can find everything there. We're also part of the small drafting group that has been preparing a UN common approach to a pollution-free planet, which we hope will be adopted soon. So here, I hope I'm not stirring too much the pot, but I would like to share some of our takings on this process that we have been accompanying. First, everybody here corroborated what I'm going to say. We have enough evidence to establish that toxic chemicals are responsible for ongoing massive human rights harms that negatively impact multiple aspects of human life and dignity. The UN, including OHCHR, the Special Rapporteur, and some agencies, scientists, civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, frontline communities, unions, amongst others, have been highlighting, I should also mention states, have been highlighting for quite a while the multitude of impacts of chemicals and waste in the environment, in our health and in our life. Despite all this, and just mentioned by Marcos, now there is a huge disconnect in environmental negotiations, and the approach has been siloed, including at the national level. More often than you can imagine, I hear that human rights are political, too controversial. If we mention human rights, this is going to stall negotiations, so let's just leave it aside. You have no idea how many times I hear that. And now the arguments are getting more complex because they mentioned to put CBDR in the middle as it is not compatible with human rights, which is completely not true. So there is a lot of, it's a constant work of demystifying what human rights is about. If we do not deal with this crisis in a holistic and integrated approach, we will continue being stuck with a lack of ambition and of urgency that must guide us, and discussing solutions and alternatives that can be inefficient, inadequate, or even worse, harmful and misleading. Human rights promotes and provides the roadmap for the ambition that is needed. In these negotiations, crucial issues concerning environmental justice, equity and CBDR, intergenerational equity, entrenched discrimination, the situation of groups and people in vulnerable situation, and the responsibility of business are often overlooked. I personally believe that greater awareness of the obligation of progressive realization found in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights into the chemicals and waste discussions would level up the discussions, while acknowledge that states do not have the same point of departure when it comes to resources and capacity, and at the same time providing new MEAs with more teeth when it comes to implementation. We must not forget that human rights standards and obligations already guarantee all people the rights to participation, access to information, and access to justice in environmental matters. At chemicals and waste discussions, hear a lot of, seems like buzzwords, participation, transparency, and more rarely, accountability. Those principles have equivalent rights that carry obligations to states and have been included in environmental sound agreements such as ARUS and ESCASU. We need to promote a shift in the negotiations if we are to face the toxic crisis head on. There is much talk about the precautionary principle, which is key and should always be applied, but there is not so much talk about prevention. The duty to prevent exposure from toxic derives from the rights to life and health. All states are already bound by those obligations, and ensuring that they are applied to environmental matters is exclusively a matter of coherence, a renewed political commitment to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. Yet, what I see from these negotiations are calls loud and clear from civil society organizations, the UN, and an increasingly large number of member states on the need to incorporate the human rights framework into the chemicals and waste discussions. Those calls disappear from summary reports, and more concerning, from the zero draft of the plastic treaty. We hope this will be addressed in the coming INCs, and that's why the words of Ambassador Tinkopa become so crucial at this moment. If we consider that the plastic treaty should be adopted by 2025, 10 years after the Paris Agreement was adopted, in view of all we have learned from science and experience as humankind, the three hottest months that we have ever had on Earth, what's happening in Libya, in Greece, and so on, we need to aim for greater ambition. The Paris Agreement has one odd, albeit very important, and we hold to that with all we can, reference to human rights in its preamble that says, respect, promote, and consider human rights. We know that the human rights framework is respect, protect, and fulfill. We would hope that the plastic treaty sets a new bar, including human rights as part of obligations, and has been called by several member states at INC2, especially under the articles on just transition and on health. How can we talk to health without talking about the right to health? And finally, human rights mechanisms also have their role to play in breaking silos. We have undertaken a desk review of human rights recommendations that have addressed the BRS conventions. And while there is a lot more that needs to be done, we have found that in addition to the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Toxics, the Special Rapporteur on Environment, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the Special Rapporteur on Water and Sanitation, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its cause and consequence, and the committees on the elimination of discrimination against women, and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights have issued recommendations that specifically refer to BRS. There's a lot more to be done, and that's why spaces of discussion like this are so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Paula, for your strong message. We have now time to exchange with the room and to start discussing that before we return to our guests. And I have seen that online there have been some people engaging really very dynamically. I'm turning to the Special Rapporteur Marcos, you have heard the colleagues from the various processes speaking on some of the efforts that are ongoing. You have also heard both from Therese and now from Ana Paula some strong messages that we have also heard at the other sessions here with the special rapporteurs on the fact that also some of these rules or obligations already exist. So what's your take on what you have heard before we turn to our guests?
Thank you, Diana, and thanks to all that have taken the mic to show what a rich, diverse, and complex scenario it is that we're living in at this moment. In that sense, it's sometimes the case that chemicals and wastes as a subject are eclipsed in public opinion and international policy making and finance by climate change. And I think this goes to show that the complexity of chemicals and waste is much broader than climate change. Not that climate change is a simple matter, but here we're dealing with so many substances from so many areas in so many ways, and with a fragmentation that is also making it difficult for at times to make progress. Perhaps I'll offer a couple of reactions on a couple of the instruments that have been mentioned. So on the Basel Convention, I think it's instructive to look at how the Basel Ban Amendment began to close what was a huge gap in that instrument that at the time of the negotiations led to a lot of controversy. If we look back in time, I was a kid at the time, I would say. But from the preparatory works, one can see that the African group walked out of the final conference in protest because of the way that the text was framed. Is that going to be the future of the plastics treaty? Well, hopefully not. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the entry into force of the Basel Ban Amendment, I think, is a very important step forward. And it shows that at times, bans do have a place. It's not just reduction or minimizing. There may be situations where bans are needed. And the recent debates at the Rotterdam Convention, I think, highlight this. Again, if we look back at the preparatory works of that instrument, the G77 at the time in China proposed a ban on the export of hazardous pesticides that had been banned in their countries of origin. I don't know that they would take that position today, but that's not what the convention says. The convention articulates what is a shared responsibility based on risk management and decision by importing countries. In my country visits, I've realized that importing countries do not have the capacity to undertake those assessments. And so this construct begins to break down. And instead, because the regulator is tasked with an impossible task, the information begins to come from industry. There's still the cozy relationship between industry and the regulator. Many people call that corporate capture. So there's unfinished business with regards to highly hazardous pesticides in international trade, and perhaps it is ICCN 5, the acronym that is now well known, that can begin to put into that. But it's not only developing countries that have challenges when it comes to implementing these instruments. People recently visit Australia, as I mentioned in the interactive dialogue yesterday with the Human Rights Council. Australia itself has ratified the Stockholm Convention, the original 12, 30 dozen, as we've sometimes described, but has not ratified any of the amendments of the new listings of persistent organic pollutants under that instrument. There are internal regulatory issues in the external governance system that's been part of this, but it goes to show that the dynamism of the instruments are not always reflected in the internal way of the parties to it. It is very encouraging to hear you speak about how human rights are in the works, the principles and the preamble. When I looked at the draft of course, the basic control search first thing, and found that rights are mentioned when it comes to intellectual property rights or proprietary rights, not otherwise. And so this was a question to ask. It is also concerned that for the first two sessions of the negotiation, committee, much time that an outsized amount was devoted to process, whether consensus or unanimity, and this was seen as a delaying tactic by countries that do not want to robust instrument. If we look at negotiating history of human rights instruments, we see that there was voting that took place in regards to specific proposals, and that's how we can put into that programs, similar to human rights and so much that could be said. Richard, I want to pick up on the point that you made, also echoed by Arthur, that human rights based approach is a process of dialogue. You mentioned this in the context of the intercessional processes that are going on. I recently was listening to the former chair of the negotiating committee for Minamata, Ambassador Uruguay. He was speaking of how Minamata was a dynamic treaty that was intended, that was expected to be amended to deal with emerging threats. That is one of the points I made in the report to the human rights council, small scale gold mine. So we see a robust instrument that is being effective, but it's working, so it incorporates lessons from history of the treaty making, and yet there are some tweaks that are necessary to enhance its effectiveness. I want to begin to conclude. I don't want to extend too much, but I do want to thank Ambassador for recent leadership in France to plastic pollution. As you mentioned, the decision by the UN Environment Assembly to move forward towards legal environmental with the mandate of looking at life cycle, a comprehensive approach. The representative mentioned, we look at waste that is essential. We don't go upstream, we will be picking up garbage from beaches for it. We want to tackle this problem, we really need I'm proud of your office, so this goes to my first point. The fact that we're here shows that the environment is not just climate change, but this cannot be ignored. And the 10 messages that your office put out some time ago on these issues, I think are worth recalling, bringing back, because they do offer a distillation and a synthesis of various topics that we're talking about. So much more could be said, but I don't want to extend it.
Thank you very much, Marcos. So let's now move to those who didn't get the occasion to speak. Another speaks in the room, and that's because our time is person first. We want to react on some of the elements you have heard. Sorry. So please introduce yourself when before the mic is here, the center you turn left. So no problem of audio. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Gustavo Lagos from Chile, professor at the Capital University. I've been in environment for 40 years or more, and professor of environmental management for 30 years. So this is to say that I know about these matters, not very much, indeed. But I think I take up what Marcos Orellana said about the Basel Convention, because in fact I was here in the Basel Convention discussing matters in the early 90s, right, related to problem. But I don't want to go back to the specific problem. I think it's worthwhile to look back on the mistakes that were made that time, so that we don't make the same mistakes again. I think, I picked this up from what Marcus said. And addressing specifically the ban, put forward by the basketball that time, which created a number of huge problems. And I don't have an evaluation of what the result is, but certainly I think we can learn from those experiences. That's the first thing. The second thing was what you mentioned, this is also the use of the precautionary principle. There are two things which yes. Indeed, the precautionary principle was used in the past, at that time 30 years ago, but then it lost impetus, right? And now it may be picking up again. Now this is maybe good, if it is properly used, it's properly regulated, especially in the context of this huge problems that you mentioned. That the toxic problem has been eclipsed by climate change. This is true. Biodiversity has been eclipsed by climate change. But the question is, we have seen that in Chile recently, the return of the use of precaution indiscriminately, and by different instances within the state. And this is not good, because people don't measure the consequences, which is to delay the processes to evaluate environmental impacts. And this generates very important economic effects. So I just wanted to mention this, because if the precautionary principle is going to be used again in a broad way, I think it should be well thought and well regulated. When should be out, and who should be? Because there is the danger that it's used by everyone in any case. And that will bring us to a halt.
I also want to apologize for who's online, because the camera cannot be some parts of the room. So we couldn't see it, but we could see it clearly. So we have had a lot of reactions online. So thank you for reacting online.
Just one very small comment, very shortly, which just to continue what has been said by the Special Rapporteur about some of what came out in the zero draft of the coming negotiation. And I was wondering if you have the privilege of having the room with us, how they would see the possibility to increase or bring back the question of human rights in the discussion, because my feeling is, perhaps a more personal feeling, that the zero draft was not, on that particular aspect, totally reflected the wide range of proposals we heard in the previous meetings. Now, I know that it's, as has been said, it's a touchy issue, sharing that's one of the difficulties, but obviously, and I think we heard it, and this morning we had another event where again we saw how can we bring back in the coming discussion this issue so that it doesn't fall. And as we said before, it's coming 10 years after the Paris Agreement, we have a very strong and important human rights language in the Paris Agreement. The next treaty in plastic must not fall anyway below that. So it's very important to give the same strength to this issue. To continue what was said before, we just heard from Professor from Chile. Yes, the toxic issue must not fade away because we have we're in triple planetary crisis, and the instruments must have this equal. So that's the question that we raised.
Thank you.
I'm planning to mark and make you all about even doing that more even more clearly. Think of something like
No, thank you very much for the comments. I would like to hear more, but I think everybody wants to find out about its citizenship. The precautionary principle is something that we always advocate. I think that the definition itself is very key when it comes when there is a risk of harm. And the risk of harm has to be very clear. So I think that it's not like blowing the wind. It's something that is more complete than that. And when science has not come to to agreement or conclusion on that, that's when principle acts. And something that we have been brainstorming with some organizations that we were close with is that how to bring that concept, that a principle that is very related to the new context of the no data, no mark, into something that is not only associated with Europe, but to be applied into like more internationally. And that is part of the thinking that we have, and then we hope that we will manage to get this step further and engage in the discussion of how to amplify the no data, no market to other contexts. But I'll be interested in perhaps not this very involved.
Thank you. No, I'm happy to continue the conversation offline. I'd be very interested to investigate about the perspectives as justice, the prospects of human rights in the negotiations.
Thank you. What we understand that the text include all the remarks on position of the different countries. And this is a sort of draft, it's the beginning, but I guess that is a strong position that we need to have a conditions and robust text that include human rights. I guess that is for sure. We also need to have from the state a complete measure that includes human rights to read the text. So I hope in the next meeting we can revise the text and also receive all the complete measures from the state to start negotiations and include human rights. And I must say, because I guess this is very personal, to include also gender equality. Because both are very linked. If we don't talk about gender equality, it's nothing, we don't have conclusions from text. So we hope that happens in the next meeting in November, and as the rule, we can say that we are going to put on that a text to be reflect with a strong position on human rights and also gender.
Thank you so much, guys. That Brenda also wants to add something. Sure, I'm happy to just also compliment these comments and investors' points. And I hope so. Special Rapporteur mentioned doing a search on the document for human rights language, and so I think it's more subtle than the zero draft of things like transparency and provision for that, protection of human health. I do hope in the second complementary document that the Secretariat is compiling a synthesis document where we are collecting information on some of the placeholders that are not filled in the zero draft this time, such as preamble and principles, specifically the substance we're getting in the submissions and collecting into the synthesis document definitely considers many human rights principles, and we are compiling that into the zero draft at this point. So I hope you can feel reassured that in the synthesis paper, we will see aspects very, very related with the preamble principles as we're seeing come through in the submissions from members that we're working on The deadline for the submissions was the 15th of September. So we are compiling the synthesis paper based on those submissions. So we will need a few more weeks to actually finish that paper off. But when you do see it, please rest assured that there will be direct linkages in there.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm going to Anna.
Yeah, just one follow-up question. I think it's a very good question. Again, it's pretty to be sure Brenda and here. The only thing that I would ask is that human rights, if it's not mentioned, it's not visible. It has to be. If it's not in the text, it's always there. It's hanging there. It just becomes something that we are going to talk in meetings, and then it's not going to be even records of the meeting. See, human rights is not only about principle. Human rights carries. And those obligations already exist. So we are not inventing it. I think that is something that we should remember. Human rights have to be explicit. Human rights are not only principles. They carry and those obligations. Of course, having a treaty that is informed by human rights, that informed by human rights principles, that is something that we need at this point in our shared life. I don't think it's you might imagine the people that doesn't include this. What we would like to see is that the human rights obligations are also included. And human rights obligations, and I also think, and I think we must be developed for also the need of gender equality. And that is something that we are fighting very hard to change. Some expressions they stick, must they stick, there's nothing we can do about. And I'm going to talk about vulnerable groups. Another, they were made because of the seriousness. Do we need to start referring to them as legal individuals, groups and people in vulnerable situations? That situation, if everything we're working for changes, it won't not be anymore vulnerable. No? So I think it's important, and this is a sort of like change the mindset that promotes change in practice as well. And those are small things that we start addressing in text of treaties, in decisions of COPs, can already make a difference also in how we see those groups and how they see themselves. So,
Right, Donna. We are getting close to the end of the session. We still have a few minutes to go. But I wanted to give the floor back to all the panelists because I wanted to hear from them. You have heard various comments and some strong messages, and we have some processes coming up. So I will go and now I need to choose the order in which I should be going. So maybe I will end with Peru, but I will start in the order of the station that I think is the series are expected by our friends from the Barcelona and several conventions, and hear for them from what you heard, what are you taking over to further strengthen this agenda in the work. So I will start from you, David.
Okay, well, the first thing that we have, for years now, we've had a gender action plan.
Just speak loud because the colleagues online are having issues with really hearing you talk.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there are many things that have been going on within the convention. The texts themselves, of course, have ideas like the cautionary principle and the idea that absence of scientific certainty is not a reason for not taking action, and so those are sort of built in already. But and then I was speaking to mention that within the Stockholm Convention, the Rotterdam Stockholm Convention, we've had for about 6-7 years now. We've had a gender action plan. We have similar approaches to that, and we have seen increases in the number of more of a balance in terms of gender for chairs of subsidiary bodies, chairs of plenary itself. We have 2 female presidents this time, which is the first, second time that's happened, so that's quite an improvement. We have the chairs training, where we train chairs of contact groups, and we're increasingly we make sure that and then we do, of course, studies looking at the impact of chemicals on, now we use the right term, people in vulnerable situations. Appreciate that wording, wrote it down, I tried to use that is much better. Other than that, it's I think we need to continue to try to make sure that we integrate human rights into the various issues, every single issue, including sort of the components it looks at human rights. As we develop the documents which become decisions for the next conference of the party, I think there will be more opportunities for that to take place. But as I say, we do have a very rich process of including observers in our work, and so I really think it's part of the DNA of the UN. It's certainly part of the DNA of BRS, and I know that what they have been very committed to this. So I don't know what else I can say at this point, but it's important.
Thank you, David. As the same father on the further, let me move to Therese. You have a huge delegation of ICANN there for some of the takes on the way forward.
Thank you, Diana. I agree with many of the things that the previous speakers have been raising. And at IPEN, we will continue to bring local realities and scientific data to the negotiations, which my colleagues are currently doing at ICCM5. I'm really happy to hear that there are several of the panelists that have raised the importance of open participation and ensuring that scientists and other knowledge holders are part of these discussions. I think this will be very, very important moving forward. I would also like to echo Ana Paula's note on the importance of prevention. Preventing exposure to toxic chemicals need to be at the center. And as Marcos said, bans will have a role, as we've also seen under the BRS conventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. We go back to the room, and next conference of the parties we'll have in Geneva will be the Minamata Convention. So I move to you, Richard.
Okay, thanks. I was in a bit of a reverie when I was just reflecting on prevention, but I will not go there because it is a loaded topic, and certainly, anyways, I'm slipping. But what I just wanted to end with is that the issue of human rights and with regard to the ongoing and upcoming negotiations really has to start at the national level. For those of you listening, and if you are all stakeholders, and coming from a stakeholder group prior to my role at the Secretariat, it is very important to bring these issues generated at the national level so it can be echoed in Geneva or wherever it may be, in Bonn, in Nairobi. If we start just putting things at the meeting table, that's too late. So I think there's opportunity to bring the human rights issue into fore, and starting at the national level. So that again, thank you again to the organizers. I end my intervention there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So now let's move to the plastic treaty process. And
thank you. So a few closing points, I suppose. The human rights agenda has evolved since some of the other and older instruments. So I think it's really clear that we can learn from the past and build, and we must, and build human rights in from the outset. In terms of tactics and process, I would just really urge that the chair's zero draft is on the table. And from my perspective, having been closely involved, it is a comprehensive and thoughtful piece that the chair has developed. So we would really urge members, backed by civil society, to come ready to the table at INC3 to support the chair's zero draft and to dig into the negotiations quickly. That's a key message from our side. And in terms of further terminology, etc., stay tuned for the synthesis report that the Secretariat is compiling, and it does elaborate on a number of the placeholders where human rights, of course, will certainly be considered for integration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ana Paula, I think I will move to you next.
I think that I've done my list.
Previously my,
Sure.
so I'm just going to thank, and I mean, really appreciate engaging and working with you on this process, and I look forward to continue finding ways to strengthen this collaboration, be it through side events, but also during the intersessional period with not only civil society, but also with colleagues who serve as secretaries of all these negotiation processes and conventions.
Starting by next week already in Zimbabwe, we will be very active. Maybe I go to Her Excellency before I close with Marcos. Excellency.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, the three things to highlight. The first one, human rights and gender equality are essential in all convention or initiative related to environment. Second, there are several initiatives going on, so we need to push for that to be robust document or to making alive more of those that is in this initiative. And third, I guess we need also capitalize the political will in that moment. I guess especially for plastic treaty. That I guess there is a political will. States are very much involved on having a treaty, so we need to push for that, and we need to have a document for the next 2 years, maybe 2025 or 26. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'm turning to the Special Rapporteur. I will let you close the event with your final remarks.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you to everyone for your insights on this quite topical matter. If I could start with some closing thoughts, I want to pick up on something that Yves Ledor mentioned about non-regression. I think it's key to, or if we look at the 2006 Dubai Declaration and the first session of the International Conference on Chemicals Management, it reaffirmed the commitment to protecting human rights in very explicit terms. Will we have an ICCM 5 outcome that regresses from such explicit commitment? I think this is a good segue also to highlighting a point that also made by Ana Paula about the importance of explicit mention, so that we're not divining or trying to guess or trying to figure out, but that there is a clear expression of the importance of human rights in every multilateral instrument in the chemicals and waste cluster. And that, of course, includes the post-2020 framework that's expected to come out of ICCM 5, also has relevance to the Plastic Pollution Treaty and other instruments. That's not enough, of course, and design issues are important, and that's where we'll be hopefully engaging quite intensely with the negotiations of the Plastic Pollution Treaty and other instruments, so that the human rights elements can, yes, inform, but also be reflected in and form part of the fundamental architecture of those instruments. Two more things. One, CBDR was mentioned, perhaps almost in passing, but does have a role to play in these discussions. I do not want to leave it hanging. If we look at the debates at the UN General Assembly on the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, there were a number of states that took the floor to speak about CBDR. And quite simply, the concerns, various camps have been that if CBDR is included, then certain countries may say we do not have obligations on the right to a healthy environment until we're giving money or until others do something. Whereas that, I would say, is not the way that the common but differentiated responsibility principles has been articulated in international environmental instruments, So the recognition of the different pressures, the different capacities, and the different responsibilities, but also the common responsibility. And that is the big part that I want to emphasize here. I had a country visit to South Africa recently, a few weeks ago, maybe last month, where the issue of just transition from coal came. South Africa relying predominantly on coal. Can it just simply from one day to the other shut off the coal-fired power plant? What does that do to jobs and the economy? And what does it do to people that are breathing contaminated air every day, day in and day out? These are not easy issues, but South Africa cannot and should not be left alone to deal with them. And that is where CBDR comes into play. The international assistance that is due with international cooperation. So this is my life. The international cooperation is where human rights and the environment find common ground, can help us move forward, and then it can also continue to inspire us in bringing a human rights-based approach in chemicals and waste. So with that, I want to conclude.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rapporteur. So now with that, we will close this event, and the thematic of this transition is one of the topics that we will address at one of the talks that we are having tomorrow. So first, I would like, of course, to thank all the panelists who joined us today here in person and online, and all the attendees here in the room and online. The Geneva Toxic Free Talks continue tomorrow with 2 sessions. You have the information here on the screen. The first tomorrow at 1 p.m. we'll look at the agrotoxics in our food and environment. So we invite you to join us for that session. And we will have a second session that we will indeed look at the issues related to the conditions for chemical workers. So we hope to see what those goes. But it won't end tomorrow, because on Friday we have 2 official side events to the human rights council in Chile. One hosted with Chile on the report that the Special Rapporteur has presented to this session of the human rights council. And we have 2 other talks also, another one on another report that the Special Rapporteur presented earlier, where we will engage with our colleagues from the International Maritime Organization. And the last one, we look at the right to science. This is another report that the Special Rapporteur has also presented here to the. So with that, we look forward to see you at the sessions, and we thank you once more for having us.
Yes, thank you. En algún momento estuvo comiendo hecho para visitas.